Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh. Most of the people we talk to on the podcast, myself included, grew up with the original trilogy as the only Star Wars there was, making our experience of the prequels something fundamentally different. I've been interested in talking to fans who got into Star Wars via the prequels, and today I'm presenting a conversation I had with a user I met on the originaltrilogy.com forums named Keith, aka Octorox, who first got into Star Wars in the lead up to Revenge of the Sith at the ripe old age of 12. Just a note here, this chat happened last summer, but I wanted to hold it back for our prequel focused season because I think it fits better here alongside the topics of our other recent episodes. I should also note that due to a technical malfunction on my end, my microphone wasn't working during the recording, so my audio isn't the best, but Keith's side is crystal clear, and he had some fascinating insights that I didn't dare want to lose. So without further ado, here is the conversation I had with Keith from last summer about his experience coming to Star Wars during the time of the prequels. I'm pleased to be joined by Keith.
I'm glad to be here.
So, Keith, if you don't mind me saying, you post on the original trilogy message board, which is a website primarily about fan edits and fan preservation. Is
Yeah,
that
that's
that's
correct. And
right?
it's a little ironic that I grew up with the prequels and I'm active on originaltrilogy.com, but it's kind of I've been with the site for a long time and it's kind of morphed from being a site specifically kind of for fans of the original trilogy to kind of congregate. I know when way back in the day when like the force.net was like very prequel positive, like some of the like more disgruntled parts of the fandom kind of gathered there, but it's really evolved. So many like fan edit projects have come out of there. So it's really evolved into kind of just like a general community for fan edits, preservation of the films, like, and really all kinds of discussion. And I find it's probably one of the these days, it's one of the more chill Star Wars fan communities out there. So I
I would
enjoy. Yeah.
no, I would agree with you. You know, in full candor, a lot of Star Wars online fandom spaces I find difficult
hmm
for one reason or another, and the original trilogy generally is always a fun read. So you said you experienced the films in the episode order. So
Yeah.
was your first Star Wars movie The Phantom Menace?
Yeah, so I came to it a little late, Star Wars. So I was born in 91. So I was probably about 12-ish when I first got into Star Wars, which I know like compared to some people it's like I watched it when I was 5 or whatever. It's a little late to get into it, but basically I had a friend at the time who was really into Star Wars and the basically the advertising and the hype for the Revenge of the Sith was just starting up. This was like around 2004, I believe.
Mm.
Like the first trailers were coming out. It was being advertised on TV commercials and as a kid, honestly as a kid, I mostly watched animated stuff more than even live action. I grew up with Disney, the Disney Renaissance, so like Lion King, Little
Hmm.
Mermaid, all those movies. I grew up with watching Nickelodeon, Nicktoons, and Cartoon Network in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And honestly, yeah, so that's kind of how got introduced to it, was kind of seeing those commercials, hearing my friend talk about it, and he had kind of like the Lego sets. And I think the Phantom Menace was when they started doing the Lego sets, and he had all that stuff. So I kind of wanted to get into it. So I went to my dad actually, because and I asked my dad, like, hey, I want to get into Star Wars. Like, will you watch these movies with me? And of course, he's someone who saw all three of the original trilogy in theaters, when they premiered. So, he's like, sure, like we'll start with those. And my thought at the time was like, hey, well, wait a minute, like these are numbered, 1 through 6. And, from what I'm hearing, what my friend told me is that these ones, even though they're newer, they come first. You're supposed to watch these, my kind of like 12-year-old, I was kind of like buying into to George Lucas's kind of preferred way of kind of imagining how a new fan will kind of or a kid will kind of watch through the movies. So I can't 100%. So we actually did end up watching the prequels first. We rented from Blockbuster the DVDs for Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. I
Had your dad seen the prequels before, or no? Was it this first
He
time as
had
well?
no, he had not. He had not seen the prequels. He had watched the original trilogy when it came out in theaters, and he just hadn't really thought much about Star Wars since then.
Sure.
Um,
Like most
you
normal
know,
people,
yeah,
not like us.
ne- neither one of my parents were really like. I was definitely introduced to things by my parents sometimes, but neither of them were really people who were like, a lot of times Star Wars fans, they're like, oh, if I have kids, it's like, I want to introduce my kids to it at the right time. Or like, I want my kids to kind of watch all the stuff that I did growing up. Neither of my parents were really like that. They didn't really push anything on me. And that's probably why I hadn't seen Star Wars and I was 12. Um, but anyway, so we rented the Phantom Menace to start with, the DVD. And this is the DVD, so we had the puppet Yoda in Phantom Menace and all that stuff. And we watched it on. I think we had a pretty nice TV for the time, but it was like a 30 something inch CRT.
CRT. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I do think there is something to watching it on a CRT. The kind of like the differences in the visual effects and stuff are not as noticeable at a lower resolution. But
Yes,
anyway,
that's true.
yeah, so we watched those. I honestly don't remember if it was that I watched 1 and 2 and then I watched Revenge of the Sith in theaters and then I watched the original trilogy, or if I watched it like 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 3. Because
Oh, really?
I might have, because I was getting into Star Wars um in the lead up to Revenge of the Sith. So I know they came out with that original trilogy box set in 2004, the 2004 DVD set, and
Yes. Yes, I
I
remember that.
that those were the ones I had, and they were the full screen versions, the pan and scan, not the widescreen, which was a mistake, but I think it was kind of like because I was getting it like I think we were really getting it for my dad, but it was really for me, because I wanted to watch them. So I would ask
Well,
him,
hey,
like,
nothing
yeah,
wrong with growing up with a pan and scan of the original trilogy. That's what I did
yeah,
too, and at even lower
yeah.
resolution. So
I think the
no
idea was like,
snobbery here.
the idea was like, oh, well, of course you want it to fill up the screen, right? But like, you don't think about the fact that you're losing a bunch of picture information on the left and right side. But, yeah, so I may have watched those 2004 original trilogy discs before I saw Revenge of the Sith in theaters. I'm honestly not sure, but it's that kind of like I was watching it all at the same time, so it was like all kind of a blur. I didn't have kind of the experience of watching the prequels or watching the originals and then sitting with those and then watching the prequels or vice versa. Like, it was, to me, it was just all one.
Yeah,
I knew that the prequels were newer. I knew
right.
that they, had quote unquote better effects because they were newer and they were made with newer technology. I understood that, but I didn't really think of it as like two distinct. I thought of it as one story, I guess,
Yeah.
which is kind of like what I guess George Lucas was going for. So
No, absolutely. That was his stated
yeah,
intention. So that's
yeah,
certainly what it was. Out of curiosity, do you remember what your feelings or thought or reactions were to the Phantom Menace and then episode two
yeah.
when you saw them the first time? I mean, clearly you enjoyed them enough to keep on
I did,
watching.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, the thing is, as a kid, I really like. So I started obviously with a lot of animated stuff, and then I kind of got into fantasy. And that's kind of how I saw Star Wars. I didn't really get into sci-fi until later. I was really, I was into Harry Potter. I don't know. I definitely had read The Hobbit. I don't know if I had watched the Lord of the Rings films yet. It was all kind of around the same time, but I feel like I didn't see those in theaters, so I might have watched them a little later. But like I was really getting into fantasy. So when I watched the Star Wars prequels, I was kind of looking at it through that lens. Like these are epic fantasy films that have spaceships and stuff in them. I wasn't
Well,
kind
I mean,
of
they
look
really are. They really are.
Yeah,
I mean, like I think that's
yeah,
actually a really good, transition, uh, like a it's a really good way to move from like kind of high fantasy to science fiction because Star
yeah,
Wars is really fantasy with the iconography of science fiction, and like my
yeah.
book.
And I feel like the prequels have even I feel like even tilt more towards fantasy and perhaps even less of the science fiction than the original. I mean, you could say something like, "Oh, the midichlorians," that's a very science fiction concept, but in terms of like the visuals, like it was very kind of these kind of like it was much more something like you would think of in like a Lord of the Rings. Like it was kind of like courtly drama
Mm,
mixed with kind of high fantasy and these like these lush environments of like with Naboo and everything. It was kind of these lush landscapes and kind of the idyllic green pastures that you might see in like of Lord of the Rings or something versus kind of the gritty used universe kind of feel of the original trilogy. And
absolutely. And the
like,
main characters are
yeah,
like knights with swords, and like you don't have like a Han
exactly.
Solo sort of like rough and
Yeah.
tumble greaser.
And I think that's something that like is a big differentiator between kind of fans who grew up with the prequels and fans who grew up with primarily the original trilogy is honestly Han Solo never interested me that much. I was way more interested in what was going on with Luke than I was with Han Solo because I cared about the Jedi and I cared about like the Skywalker saga. Like
That that's
that's what I'm
fascinating to me.
yeah, that's what I
That's
was
very interesting.
invested in. Yeah, to me, Han was more like I liked Han, like he's a fun character, but to me that wasn't the core story. The core story was Luke and Anakin, and like, it's very I think very much how George Lucas saw it is,
Yeah.
yeah, this is a father and son, a kind of intergenerational saga, like an epic. It's almost like an epic poem in six parts or something, is like how he was conceiving of it at that point. I don't know when he was conceiving the original trilogy. I know he was thinking of some of those things. He had ideas for the prequels, but it wasn't, there definitely were other elements to it. It wasn't the same thing. I mean, especially like I'm thinking of something like the Flash Gordon inspiration
Hmm.
in the original trilogy. I feel like that's more in terms of sort of the storytelling is very like Flash Gordon, kind of like it's an adventure story. Whereas I feel like in the prequels, it's a little more literal. Like the visuals are Flash Gordon inspired. Like if you look at like the Naboo starships and stuff, it's like
Right.
all curves and all kind of like
Shiny
chrome,
and
chrome. Yeah,
yeah.
so like I think it's interesting kind of like how his conception of it evolved over time, and I can see how that was frustrating for fans. I mean, for fans of the original trilogy. I think for me, and we'll kind of get into how my thoughts on the prequels kind of evolved over time, but um, I would say to the extent that I do enjoy those movies, I enjoy them in a very different way than I maybe enjoy the original trilogy films or even the sequel films. Like to me,
Sorry,
you kind of
the way you enjoy the prequel.
exactly like
Yeah.
the way you kind of have to. I will say, as a kid, they totally worked on me. So like the Phantom Menace, even as a kid, I think Jar Jar and some of that stuff, I felt a little like, okay, this is, I was 12. So like, I'm like, maybe I'm a little above this, I feel like, but all the kind of the stuff with the Jedi and Darth Maul and the kind of like the visuals and the music, like all of that kind of like worked on me. And it kind of like, for me, it was like a very compelling, at the time, a very compelling like introduction to the universe of kind of like, this is a really cool fantasy sci-fi universe that I want to, that, that I got sucked into. And it made me want to watch the other movies.
Well, I
And then
mean,
it's,
well, I mean, then
yeah,
then then George Lucas was right on the money
yeah,
because that's exactly what he was trying to do. He, I believe, said he was
yeah,
making movies for 10-year-olds, but so
yeah,
maybe that's why maybe you were a little
yeah,
over the Jar Jar stuff,
yeah,
no, I think that was his intention, and you
yeah,
are living proof that it succeeded.
yeah. And Attack of the Clones, I honestly, I think I remember finding Attack of the Clones a little more boring actually than the Phantom Menace. I think, I probably the romance aspects at the time, like where, 12-year-old boy, it wasn't really, maybe I wasn't the most into that, but the other stuff, like the stuff with the clone army and Obi-Wan investigating and then the big arena fight at the end, like all of that was cool to me as a kid. Like it just worked. It worked the way I think for the most part that George kind of wanted it to work. And we'll get into Revenge of the Sith. That was the first Star Wars film that I saw in its original theatrical release. Um and that's a movie that I still have a strong fondness for to this day. I think the first two prequels, when I watch them, there's certainly a lot that I appreciate about them still, but there's also a lot of things that take me out of it a bit as somebody who's, seen more movies and is older and kind of, approaches it from the perspective of someone who has kind of learned about filmmaking and, you know, yeah, but Revenge of the Sith, despite its issues, still works on me. And I watch, and obviously being part of the original trilogy forums, I've been exposed to kind of various fan edits and I've even made my own. But Revenge of the Sith is the one prequel where I can watch the original version, and just have a good time with it. And the issues with it don't really um they don't bother me that much. And I can kind of get into that more, but yeah,
No, yeah, I think Revenge of the Sith is definitely the one, uh, for me at least, where the the emotions are most visceral. I think it really hits me
yeah,
more on a visceral level, more so than um,
yeah,
the Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones,
yeah,
because I think you know that's really the whole
yeah.
reason for the
It's
prequels existing.
it's the meat of the story. It's kind of like
Yeah,
I've heard it said like, oh, George Lucas was kind of riffing for two movies, and then he's like, all right, now here's all the stuff that I like knew I actually had to be part of these movies. That said, I don't think the other two movies are not important or not essential. I know like
I,
some
I
people
agree.
like there's that whole idea of the machete cut where it's like you just cut out the Phantom Menace. You don't need it.
I I don't I don't like that, because
Yeah.
so look, full disclosure, and I will get into this in much more
Yeah.
detail over, many episodes, future episodes to come. But
Yeah.
I have complicated feelings about each of the prequel films. But I have a real soft spot for the Phantom Menace. It's actually, for my money, the one prequel that feels the most like the original trilogy. And I think this is a theory, but I think it's because it was shot on 35 millimeter film. So it has that kind of warmth and that
Mm,
grain, unless you watch it
yeah.
on
Yeah.
streaming on
Sure.
Disney Plus, where it's
Yeah.
been DNR to hell and everyone looked like a wax
Yeah.
figure. But the the I'm a big sort of proponent of the idea that you know the the aesthetic quality of the image, like that 1080p digital video look, especially in Attack of the Clones, for
Yeah.
me creates this like visual separation between
Mm,
the first four movies and
yeah.
the next two prequels. But that's just could be my own personal
I
hang up.
no, I think you're onto something. You know, the thing about me, I think, is the aesthetics. There are definitely things, especially with Attack of the Clones, there are definitely elements that don't hold up so well, like in terms of the CGI and stuff. But the thing about the aesthetics is, I think, like, you know, you being someone who grew up watching the original trilogy first, is I think people are very attached to those aesthetics. It's the kind of, again, like I
Yeah.
said, the used universe, but also kind of like the 35 millimeter, like optical effects, like everything kind of feels handmade. You got the puppets, all that. And I love that stuff. I think it's really cool what they were able to do. Um, but I also, I grew up with CGI. Like it was just kind of a thing that was in movies. And
Yeah.
so the prequel trilogy, to me, it does look dated. Some of it looks dated. It's dated in a different way than the original trilogy
Right.
is.
Absolutely.
And
For sure. Yeah.
I think it's kind of an aesthetic. It's a different aesthetic. And I think you either, you know, I now I know there are people like my age and even younger than me that they have the same kind of warm, fuzzy nostalgia for early CGI that people who grew up in the 80s and 90s maybe do for practical effects. Like,
Which I
uh,
love, by the way. I love
yeah,
that.
like you can see the seams of it. Definitely, like, not to get you technical, but things like
No, please.
ambient,
Let's get very
ambient
technical.
occlusion, like ambient occlusion and stuff there's been a lot
And
of
specular
advances in.
highlights.
Yeah, there's been a lot
And
of
let's really.
advances in CGI that make it look much more photorealistic now. But I think I don't necessarily know that I feel that nostalgic for the early CGI, but I definitely like appreciate it as like, wow, like, you know, you got to think about when this movie came out and what they were trying to do. And like, obviously their ambition kind of maybe went past like what the technology could really pull off well at the time, but I don't know. Like I was watching it again. I was watching a ton of animated stuff at the time. So to me, it's like a movie was a movie. It didn't matter if it was animated or live action or CGI or, hand drawn. And like now, as someone who studied film, I have an appreciation for like all those different media and how they differ and kind of the aesthetic value in different media. But at the time as a kid, like a movie was a movie. And so like that aspect of it was not something that ever struck me watching it as a kid. I was never like, these movies, why do these movies look so different? I was just kind of like, well, these movies are newer, so they're gonna look
Yeah,
different. But
for
also
sure.
I thought, hey, this is the the height of the Republic. This is the time where things are gonna look pristine and shiny and it's gonna look grand and it's kind of, and then the original trilogy, we've kind of got these scrappy rebels and we've got um, you know, pulling scraps together to try to mount a fight against the Empire. So like it makes sense that things look more worn and used.
Absolutely.
And so
Absolutely.
like for me, that like the aesthetics kind of tracked in that way when I was a kid. Now, do I think the prequels probably would have looked better if they shot them all in 35 millimeter and used a better blend of CGI and practical effects? I think so. But I also kind of really just appreciate them for what they are in terms of, they were pioneering. They changed the way films are made. I mean, you look at there are a lot of films shot digitally now that are almost, indistinguishable from film. Like you look at a movie like Knives Out or
Knives Out. I was
something.
just gonna say, yeah,
Yeah,
the DP. I forget his name. It's on the tip of my tongue. I feel terrible. But
yeah,
he convinced Ryan Johnson, who wanted to shoot it on 35, that
yeah,
he could make it
yeah.
look indistinguishable.
But you don't get to that without the kind of early versions of that, like the
Right.
rough around the edges version of that, And I think I'm sure there's a lot of Star Wars fans of an older generation who are like, okay, but don't do that with Star Wars. Make some other movie that's a experiment with digital filmmaking but I kind of, but Star Wars had a certain aesthetic and you should stick to that. But my feeling is, it kind of had to be Star Wars. It had to be something big, with the kind of cachet of Star Wars to really grab the attention and kind of, move things forward in that way.
I
So
agree with
that's just
you.
kind yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I think you're 100% right. Um,
Yeah.
my only quibble, um, and we've alluded to this already, but the idea that George Lucas really, his intention was for these films to be watched in the order you watch them, where you watch the prequels, the
Mhm.
newer movies first, and then you go to the original
Yeah.
trilogy.
Mhm.
And I just feel like some of those aesthetic differences make that
Mhm.
transition not as smooth as it could be.
And I think that was probably his idea behind the special editions was like, "All right, let's do some stuff
Spruce
to
it
the
up a little
older."
bit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
do some stuff to the older films to make it kinda track a little better, make it match up with what we're doing with the new movies, and I don't think it quite lands, as an adult, look watching the films, I don't think it quite works. I think that a lot of the special edition changes, there are some of them that I like because and we can get into that too, because my first version of Star Wars that I saw was the 2004 DVD
oh, right.
versions.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah,
Okay.
so,
Well,
so we
so
can
I have a
get into the yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no. You finish your thought.
Yeah, so I was saying, looking at it now, I can definitely tell that it's a movie from the 70s with 90s CGI sequences kind of pasted into it. But there are certain changes in the special editions that are almost, for me, kind of just preferred. It's almost like that's how I remember it. So that I'm thinking like, I know a lot of people who grew up with it have a lot of fondness for Yub Nub at the end of Return of the Jedi. I've always preferred the special edition version because it seemed more like, obviously maybe this is less important with the sequel trilogy now, but it seemed like, well, this is a grand ending to the
Right.
saga, whereas Return of the Jedi, it's like, the original version, it's kind of like, even if we're just taking it in the context of the original trilogy, like it feels like a very small scale ending for kind of a big story. Like it felt a little bit of a mismatch for me. So like there's some changes like that. Things like I like the scene they added between Biggs and Luke in A New
Yeah.
Hope. I kind of missed that when I watched the original version. And just to clarify, I've watched like almost every version at this point. I've watched fan edits. Like I know you talked to Hal 9000. He's done version, and these might actually be, I don't know if they're my preferred versions, but they're one version that I enjoy watching, which is he's kind of try to do a best of both worlds approach with taking some of the changes from the special editions and some stuff from the original versions and kind of mashing it together. And I enjoy those versions. I enjoy watching the original versions when I want to really see the filmmaking craft and see kind of what they were working with at that time. And I think that's why obviously they should release the original versions. I mean, I don't think I need to tell you that, but um, but but I was just at Tanglewood in Massachusetts, up in the Berkshires, where they were doing a concert version of The Empire Strikes Back, and they were playing the score live with the film, and they were using, I think it was, and the thing is, I'm at the point, I'm enough of a nerd now where I can track instantly like which version it is, like just by the color grade.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like they were using the 2011 version, and I
The one with
assume,
like the blue sort of
yeah,
light
yeah.
like filter all over it. Yeah.
So, and because it was projected on it was like outdoors, and it was projected on a big screen. It wasn't like it wasn't like I was watching it in a pristine presentation in a movie theater. So the color grading was less of an issue, but
Sure.
like, and I can only assume that Disney just hasn't, because I believe they have special versions where the score is not, I mean, I'm not 100% on this, but I believe for those kinds of events, they use a version where the score is removed from the film so that they can play the score live. And I
Yeah, I
assume,
think so because I think
yeah,
the music is probably on its own
yeah,
channel, so you could probably just
yeah. And I
shut off
just
that channel.
assumed Disney hasn't mastered a new version of that based on the 2019 release, the Disney Plus version. I assume they just haven't gotten around to that yet, but it was the 2011 version, and I still enjoyed the heck out of it. I mean, I think Empire is probably the least hurt
Messed
by
with.
some of the
Yeah.
yeah, and there's some changes I can almost split the difference on. Like, I like that Ian McDermott is the Emperor, in the
You kind of need that.
yeah,
Because like if this movie has any hope of working as the fifth movie, you
yeah,
need Ian McDermott in that scene.
yeah, and
There's
you
that
need
the other version only works if you've never seen the Emperor
yeah,
before and you're trying to
yeah,
maintain that sort of air of mystery. But
sure.
if you have any hope of that movie working as a part of the saga, you need that change.
Yeah, and that's how I feel, and I think some of the special edition stuff like that, like the continuity fixes and stuff, I like. I do feel like the execution could be better in some places. Like, for example, the Ian McDermott Emperor, it's very clear that he was on the set of Revenge of the
The
Sith
Revenge
and
of the Sith, yeah.
they just pulled him aside. Yeah. And same with, Hayden at the end of I know this is a really contentious one, but I'll tell you, when I was a kid and I watched Return of the Jedi and it was Hayden at the end, I cried.
No, that's another one of those changes. That's another one of those changes that, again, I think if you have any hope of this working in that intended
Yeah.
order, that's a needed change. How did you feel, just out of curiosity, seeing Sebastian Shaw's face under the mask? Because, like, it seems to me, and I was just watching in the wake of the Obi-Wan show. I think I saw kind of like a face replacement of Hayden
Yeah,
Christensen on him in that scene. It's not
I've
great, but
I've seen that. Yeah.
yeah, but the idea though that not seeing his face under that mask in that moment.
Yeah. You know, I kind of accepted it because the thing is Alec Guinness is also not Ewan McGregor. I
Well,
mean,
that's
like,
true.
so I just kind of accepted that, okay,
Well, that's
this
true.
guy plays the old version of Anakin Skywalker. And I
So
guess
let
when
me
you really
reframe the question.
yeah.
Do you accept, do you identify with that man? Do you see that as the same character?
I did when I watched it as a kid, I definitely did. I
Okay,
think,
cool.
I think, like it was never unclear to me that that was Anakin, and
Right,
obviously they did some minor changes, like they took his eyebrows off to try
right,
to
right.
make it and changed the color of his eyes to kind of make it match Hayden. So yeah, I didn't have any trouble buying that. When I watch it now, I'm kind of like, okay, this is what, 25 years after Revenge of the Sith. I'm like, this guy is very old, and Hayden was not. So,
The same thing with
uh,
Alec Guinness and Ewan McGregor.
yeah.
It's like
Al-
those twin
although,
sons age you twice as fast.
yeah, although someone pointed out to me that you know, looking at the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, Alec Guinness is actually the correct age. Like he was like in I believe his late 50s or early 60s when they filmed
Yeah,
A
I think
New
he was
Hope.
like I think he was like 57. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ewan McGregor's, in his late 40s now, I think, and he was
I think he might be.
yeah, and he
Yeah.
was in his 30s when he was in his 30s when Revenge of the Sith came out. So like it tracks actually. It's just that Alec Guinness looks like a super old guy, regardless of like
Yeah,
what his actual age was.
well, yeah. So back in the day, people used to look older,
Yeah,
and now it's like with like,
yeah.
skincare and
I
surgery, like everyone looks like a
That was
like
funny to
eternally
me
youthful.
where they were. I enjoyed the Obi-Wan Kenobi series a lot, despite
I
feeling
loved
it
it. I
was
thought
a
it was great.
yeah. I mean, it probably could have been a movie. Like I'll say that, but I think for what we got, I really enjoyed it. But one
Same.
thing that definitely stood out to me was Leia making like a bunch of comments about like how Obi-Wan looks like this decrepit old guy, and I'm like that's Ewan McGregor. Like he looks stunning.
He
Like
looks
don't
younger. He looks younger
he
than I do.
yeah, he looks younger. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, he looks wonderful. So I'm like, how dare you, Leia? But like. clearly they were trying to kind of harmonize it with his depiction in the original trilogy. So to kind of just like, oh, he's old, like you'll have to tell me he's older because I don't see it. But yeah.
Well, so I have a couple of questions for you, based on some things you said. Um, you said there are some things in the prequel that kind of pull you out when you watch it now.
hmm
I'm curious what a couple of those things might be.
Um One is I feel like there's especially in the I mean it's in all three, but it's especially hits me in the first two is there's a lot of tonal mismatch in the prequels, where I felt like the original trilogy has a pretty consistent tone. I mean, obviously Empire is darker than A New Hope, but it all kind of tracks. Whereas the prequels, and I think this was just kind of George being a little goofy and wanting to put homages into to things that he liked. So we have the diner in Attack of the Clones, or we have the two-headed announcer in Phantom Menace.
Right.
So like some of those things feel like, okay, that doesn't really feel like part of the Star Wars world, the world that he's created. It feels like something from our world that he's kind of plucked and put a direct analog in there.
That
So I
that's a good point. Yeah.
yeah, so those kind of take me out a little bit. Some of the humor, especially in Phantom Menace, like it's not as bad in the other two, but I actually like some of the humor in the prequels. I think um it depends on the actor. I think Ewan McGregor especially does a good job. He give George gives him a lot of cheesy kind of one-liners, but he's so charismatic that I feel like they just kind of land. I just kind of enjoy Obi-Wan's kind of snarkiness. I think the Jar Jar of it all and that stuff, doesn't land as well for me now. As a kid, I was like, okay, whatever. It's a comic relief character. I don't really love it, but it's like it doesn't take me out of the movie. Whereas now I'm like, okay, you could have approached that differently. And also there's kind of an element that a lot of people have rightfully brought up of, and again, I think this is George just kind of referencing paying homage to the things that he liked from older films, but there is kind of like a racial element to some of the
Yeah.
characters, the alien characters in the Phantom Menace that
Yeah. I
is
mean,
uncomfortable. Yeah.
yeah, like the Nemoidians kind of feel like they're like, Fu Manchu villains out of like a Charlie
Yeah.
Chan film and
hmm
stuff. Like
Yeah.
and Watto kind of feels like an uncomfortable, like,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
Jewish or Middle Eastern stereotype.
Yeah.
But my real belief is that these are homages to things that he loves. But the problem with just straight up,
Yeah.
referencing something you love that was a product of another culture, you're also bringing along with it all of the implicit, cultural attitudes. So without looking at those things with a critical eye, you are inadvertently perpetuating those
Mm,
same stereotypes without realizing that
Yeah.
that's what you're doing. So when he
Yeah.
says it's not racist, I
Yeah.
believe him. But when I hear someone who is a member of one of those
Yeah.
groups see it and they say it is racist, they are also correct. Do you think that there's so little Jar Jar in Attack of the Clones? Do you think that's the result of the fan reaction to the character from the Phantom Menace, or do you think that, George Lucas was like, okay, we did that and now the story's going somewhere else?
I think it might be a mix of factors. I mean, George Lucas definitely heard the fan. You couldn't miss the fan reaction. So I do think maybe there was an element of that. I also think it was just a very different type of story. I mean, the Phantom Menace, um, it's very much about it's a very like the movie kind of has a childlike feel to it because it's about a child. I mean, it's like um, and I actually a lot of people like to think some of the decisions that George has made in the prequels. And again, to talk a little bit about kind of my evolution in my relationship with the prequels, I had a period in um I would say about in college, in my late teens, early 20s, when I kind of swallowed the line that the prequels are just garbage. They're just there's nothing worthwhile. Like I think that was around the time where the Red Letter Media
Plinkett,
Plinkett
Plinkett.
reviews came out, and
Uh,
I was an impressionable film student, and I'm like, wow, these critiques are like so smart, and like I'm gonna be smart and not like these movies, and so I honestly feel bad. I think I was a bit insufferable with that at that time.
we all are at that age. You have to make no
Yeah,
apology.
um,
The Plinkett, the effect of those Plinkett videos on the conventional wisdom about the quality of those films, I think, cannot be understated. Because what's so interesting to me is that he does make a lot of valid observations,
he does.
but the vitriol
Y-
and the entitlement,
Yeah,
which again, is like he's literally playing a character. So I get that
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
so I
it's
get that
played
it's
up. Yeah,
yeah, so I get that it's like a part of the whole shtick, but it's just so mean spirited
yeah, it's
that
uncharitable. There
yeah,
isn't
yeah,
there.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
uncharitable.
there isn't even really an attempt to kind of interrogate or explore like what George was trying to do with the movies. It's just kind of like, and that's something I have struggled with a lot of the prequel criticism is I think it's, there's a lot of problems with those movies and it totally makes sense to point them out. I think some decisions George made, people attribute to incompetence that were very intentional. And like, so for example, something like making Anakin a child in the first movie, that's something that a lot of people are like, why, like, there's no reason to do that. Like, why would they do that? Why do I want to see? But I know there's the famous Patton Oswalt, um, uh, stand up routine. And I love Patton Oswalt, but like where he's kind of like, I don't want to, why would I want to see Darth Vader as a baby? Why would I want to see Boba Fett as a baby? Like, what is, and I think what he was trying to do was, and I think it's all said in that poster of that poster of episode one. It's Anakin standing, uh, uh, kid Anakin on Tatooine, and you've got the shadow of Darth Vader kind of looming up
Yeah,
behind him. And I think he's trying to show that even like the worst villains, even the scariest villains, like they were just kids too. They were, he was just a kid, and that it's kind of like trying to add depth or dimensionality into some way. And it's like, yeah, it's like nobody's born evil. You start out
yeah,
when you're a kid like every other kid. And I think that's what he was trying to say. And I think even with Boba Fett, he
absolutely.
was trying to say something similar of like, he's this grizzled bounty hunter, but he got that way because, he lost his father and he was kind of, raised on the streets kind of thing. I think he was trying to, give, these, some of these characters that were very cool, but not super dimensional, trying to kind of give this kind of a sense that, they came they weren't always that way. They started the same way as any other kid, and I appreciate that message, even though, I think it would have worked better if, and I don't want to, I don't want to say anything ill of Jake Lloyd because he was a child and he was doing the best. I'm sure he was doing exactly what George asked him to do. But I do think with a better, if they had a really good child performance there, I think that totally could have worked. I think,
I agree with you. There's actually an interesting, I think it's a New York Times video where I don't know if you recall. So on the beginning documentary on the Phantom Menace DVD, they show the screen test of the three finalists for Anakin Skywalker. And there was one of them who I think they even showed like it was between him and Jake Lloyd, and they were talking about the pros and cons. And obviously they went with Jake Lloyd. But this New York Times video caught up with the other kid today. And it was just a really fascinating, like now knowing what the movie was and what Jake
yeah,
Lloyd went through. It was like a really interesting video. Maybe I'll link to it in the show notes.
I think George knew to a certain extent that he wanted to play up Anakin as this kind of like cherubic little boy. Like
Yeah,
he was supposed to be a little over the top. He's kind of this idealized version of a little kid. And while
yeah.
I don't think it totally works in the film, like I don't think it was an accident. That's
It was not an accident. No, it was
yeah,
definitely very intentional. there are two things I think if you take out of the movie would make it work so much better. The yippee
Hmm.
and the lines where it seems like when Anakin blows up the Trade Federation ship at the end are
Yeah.
completely accidental. I think you can leave it exactly the same, but have
Yeah.
it seem like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah. And that's why, honestly, so, and I've alluded to originaltrilogy.com and fan edit. I think, and you spoke with Hal previously. I think a lot of fan edits have done that, and it's testament that it works. It works well. It works a lot better when you make those changes. I think I made my own fan edits and that are heavily based on Hal's with some other changes from other edits, and I'm kind of like growing out of love with my own edits because as I get older, I kind of like start to appreciate these movies more for what they were. And
Hmm.
I like that Hal's edits are more he's going in with a scalpel. Like he's very his the
Exactly. He
change.
leaves he
Yeah.
leaves he leaves more of it sort of intact.
Yeah. The changes that he makes are very like they all have a very specific purpose. Whereas when I was doing my edits, a lot of times I was like, oh, that dialogue makes me cringe. I'm just gonna obviously I made sure that that the film works and makes sense, but it does feel a little cut, down to the bone a little bit. And I think the way Hal kind of leaves a little more there is merit to that in that it feels more like a film, it feels more like a film that they
Like a
would
George Lucas
release.
film. Like,
Yeah,
like to go back a second to you were talking about some of the tonal weirdness in Phantom Menace, especially, and like some of the humor is a little like
yeah,
is a little questionable. But that's I mean that's George Lucas.
yeah,
Like he has an idiosyncratic sense of
yeah,
humor. He's a goofy guy,
yeah,
and like I understand why some people cringe at certain moments, but for better or worse, like this is his movie. This is him. You're seeing him on the
yeah,
screen. So the reason, like to reiterate what you just
yeah.
said, I like how Hal leaves in certain lines or certain moments that a lot of other fan editors will cut
Excise, yeah,
because it retains that character that the movie has. And I
yeah,
appreciate that. Like, again, as someone, growing older and I view movies in a
mhm,
different way and I'm more aware of context, I'm more appreciative actually of seeing things that are unique that I
mhm,
haven't seen anywhere else or I can't see anywhere else. And I think one of the strengths of Star Wars, and again, sometimes it doesn't work, but one of the things I love about Star Wars is how it's so elastic the way that
yeah,
it can on the one hand it can be hilarious, it can be goofy, it can
mhm,
be very very emotional and very serious, and
yeah,
it's a movie about the dangers of democracies becoming
yeah,
fascist empires with fart jokes. Like what is there
yeah,
to dislike
and
about that?
I think right. So, gotta stand my man Ryan Johnson. I think he put it really well, and he's had a tweet. I forget how exactly he phrased it, but he's like,
I know the
someone
tweet, I
asked,
was just riffing
yeah,
on it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
asked him what he thinks of the Star Wars prequels. And it's like George made a 7-hour movie about the dangers of fascism, of sliding into fascism for children, and like I think that's totally true. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about the prequel trilogy that I think, especially The Force Awakens, I feel like they took some of the wrong lessons, in my opinion, from the and I enjoy The Force Awakens. I think it's a really good cover band. Like I
Yeah.
think it's a really, really well made homage to the original trilogy and the original Star Wars, more specifically. But I think J.J. Abrams was very afraid of touching anything, and obviously you have to think about what the climate around Star Wars fandom was in 2015 or even 2014, 2013 when they were like conceptualizing and producing this is like he didn't want to touch the prequels with a 10-foot pole. I mean, there's like some oblique references to it, like you have a mention of clone armies and a
Clone
mention of the
Army.
Sith a mention of the Sith somewhere, but that's
Yeah.
still honestly that's even more like a lot of that stuff was in early drafts or the novelizations of the original trilogy. So like I don't even really count that as a prequel reference. I think he wanted to make there's a whole generation of fans who are like very jaded, very put off by the prequels, and he wanted to make Star Wars that, would bring those fans back and felt like kind of a warm blanket. So I don't fault him for that, but I do feel like, one thing is like the politics, like to me, Star Wars has always been political, and it's
It
one of the
is
things.
it is inherently
Yeah,
political. It's a
it's one of
very
the things.
political story. It's a
Yeah,
very political yeah. Yeah,
yeah, if
absolutely.
you listen to George talk about it, it's, I don't know if you've heard the interview he did with James Cameron on
No, the
his,
rebels are the Viet Cong, the empire is the United
yeah,
States. Like,
exactly.
it's a very political
It's very
story.
political.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think and it's funny because fans are always like, oh, the sequel trilogy, they made it political. I'm like, The Force Awakens is probably one of the least political Star Wars
Yeah.
films, in my
Well,
opinion, because he consciously, he wanted it to feel like, warm and fuzzy. He veered away, you have the Senate getting blown up, but you don't really have any context for it. You don't have any context for the universe, the state of the galaxy, or kind of like what is this precise relationship between the resistance and the republic.
what
And
even is the resistance?
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
what
He
are they
kind of,
resisting? Where
yeah, he,
it's like, so you're hitting on something that is, again, I do not fault J.J. Abrams at all. Like, his job,
mm,
the job of The Force Awakens was to
mhm,
demonstrate that they could still make Star Wars movies that felt like the old movies,
yeah,
and to re-win over the
yeah.
the goodwill that was sort of arguably lost. But the problem for me with the sequel trilogy, that I think I prefer the prequel trilogy in this regard, is that the sequel trilogy isn't about anything.
Here's what I would say to that. I think the only film in the sequel trilogy that
The
is,
Last Jedi.
yeah, that it's in conversation with the story George Lucas was telling, the sixth film story he was telling, is The Last Jedi, because I
Yes.
feel like it's the only one that kind of picks up on the themes that the prequels were even putting down. Because, like, one thing that I love about the prequels that a lot of older fans might have been put off by is that the Jedi are not so great. They're like, they're bureaucrats. He took, obviously, the Jedi have always been influenced by real world religion, and he kind of took the aspect of, and not to call out any specific religion, but like if you think of something like the Catholic Church, like it's very bureaucratic, it's very large, it's almost like a state in and of itself. And I think what George was trying to say with the Jedi is kind of they became complacent. They became part of the problem. And I think, a lot of people have an issue with Yoda's characterization. And it's kind of like, well, and I think Dave Filoni kind of talks about this too, and like his kind of series with the Clone Wars and all that kind of goes into this more. But like Yoda was kind of drinking the Kool-Aid, and he was kind of caught up in this, and I think he slowly, when he's that character in Empire Strikes Back that says wars not make one great, I think he's speaking from experience. He's not a static character. He's a character who kind of learns from the experience of the prequel trilogy. And maybe it's not all there in the text. Maybe it's a little bit subtext. I think George could have maybe been more clear in how he communicated some of these themes, but I like that they're there, and I like that Ryan Johnson picked up on that, and he was like, "Well, we're gonna have Luke disillusioned with the Jedi. We're gonna have him, you know, saying the things that fans might have been saying about the Jedi in the prequel trilogy." And I've always appreciated that.
Me too. That is actually
Yeah.
what really surprised me. It actually still really surprises me because I read it the same way you did. I saw what
Mhm.
Luke was saying up in that scene that you're referring to, where he's talking to Ray, and he's essentially like, "Did you know that the Jedi like were X, Y, and Z and blah blah blah?"
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, the way that I read that scene was like, Luke was the Star Wars fans who grew up on the original trilogy, then saw the prequels, and saw what the Jedi
Mhm.
actually were, and he was
Yeah.
bummed about it. That movie is him and the fans rediscovering that there's still good there, and to kind of
And
re-fall in love with it. I mean, that was
yeah,
my read.
I think that's a very good and accurate read. I would say though that I do think there was some intention out. I think when George did that in the prequels, you might say like that's a happy accident that Ryan Johnson picked up on and turned it into something. I would push back against that. I would say I think that intentionality was there in the prequels to show, the Jedi as complicit and show the Jedi as fallible and
No, I
bureaucratic.
agree. I agree.
Yeah. I think maybe it was different than what fans expected. And one thing I did want to talk about is kind of watching the films in 1 through 6 order versus watching the original trilogy first, and kind of how the
Yeah.
story kind of reads differently is I think I don't necessarily, so I will disclose, if I were to introduce someone to Star Wars for the first time, I would have them watch the original trilogy first, even though that's not the way that I grew up with it.
Why?
Because I think that there are aspects of those films. What the main thing is, I think A New Hope is a better introduction to the Star Wars universe than The Phantom Menace. I think The Phantom Menace can be an off-putting movie for a lot of people, and it's kind of like an idea of like put the best foot forward is one
Sure.
of the reasons. And then the other reason is that, I do think to some extent, and I think George was trying to kind of have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to have it so there's additional context to the prequels if you've seen the original trilogy first, but also a kid watching them 1 through 6 can watch them in that order and it'll work as well.
Yeah.
And I think it mostly works, but I think there are some things, like, for example, just what the Force is. Like, that's explained really succinctly and beautifully in A New Hope, and doesn't really get, or like what a Jedi is. Like, that stuff is not really, you're just kind of thrust into it, which, has kind of, its pros and cons. But I guess it's just, I think A New Hope works better as an introduction to the Star Wars universe. I almost wish well, it's almost my preferred way to show them would be watch the original trilogy first, then watch the prequels, then watch the original trilogy again after having watched the prequels. And because there are certain aspects of the original trilogy that I actually enjoyed more because of having seen the prequels. I think,
Like what, as an example?
well, I think I just connect more to, and, people, you can have any things you want to say about, Hayden Christensen, or I think he's a great actor. I think he is not given the best, dialogue or direction to work with. I think George just wasn't really concerned with that. And
Yeah.
that's fine. That's what the movie he was making. But if you watch a movie like Shattered Glass, I
Yeah.
think,
No, he's great in that.
uh, Hayden Christensen is a good actor, and I think even if you watch the Obi-Wan Kenobi, like,
He's great in Kenobi. Yeah,
he's great.
absolutely.
Yeah. So, but I think even regardless of that, or I think just having seen the downfall and having seen that character evolve, there was just more weight, when obviously it ruins the twist of Darth Vader is Luke's father, but it almost turns like kind of the situational irony into dramatic irony. It's kind of like now
Right.
he's his father, but he doesn't know that. So you're
Right.
kind of like, oh, like when is he gonna find out? How is he gonna find out? So that there is still kind of like it does work. It just works differently. If you're not, Luke isn't as much an audience surrogate. You're looking at it from a more omniscient kind of perspective.
Right.
And I think that it worked for me as a kid. I think it works. It just is different. I think also, if we're being real, if I'm going to introduce a friend or anybody to Star Wars, they probably know that Darth Vader is Luke's father, even if they've never seen a Star Wars movie. I think there's this it's such a pop cultural touchstone. I think the kind of platonic ideal of they're going to watch the original movies and they're going to be surprised by the twist. I just think it's
Yeah, like
not
that.
something that
Yeah, like
can,
that's out the window. Yeah. The other thing
yeah.
too the other thing too is that I do think that that twist is really oversignified in terms of like the shock value of it is sort of beside
Mhm.
the point. Like it's not supposed to be like a
Yeah.
gotcha,
Well,
but
and
because of the huge effect it had in popular
mhm.
culture, like it kind of became that when it's like,
Yeah,
really what it really is this character learning the worst thing he could possibly
exactly.
learn.
Which is why also Ray's parents should have stayed as
Been
nobody.
nobody because that's the worst thing he could learn. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but,
we're on the same page when it comes to the Last
yeah,
Jedi and what it was
yeah,
trying to do.
yeah. So I think even if you watch the prequels first and then you watch the original trilogy, I think it still works because the original trilogy, they're just really solid movies, and because I think a great twist or a great plot point, it works not just because it's a surprise for the audience, but because it resonates with the characters and kind of
Exactly.
what they're going through. So and I think that works, the I am your father, that works whether you know it or not, because it's what it means to Luke in that moment, like you were saying. So
Exactly. Exactly.
and there are kind of like dimensions. So specifically I'm thinking of New Hope. When I've watched the prequels first, there are definitely things that read differently than if you watch A New Hope and that's your first movie and you don't know anything else about Star Wars. Like, for example, like when Owen says, he's afraid that he has too much of his father in him. Like, I'm like, oh, that kind of reads differently, versus like when you're first watching the film, when it first came out, you might think, oh, he's just, his father was reckless. So like
Yeah,
he
like he's
was,
gonna he's
yeah,
gonna be like a spice runner or something.
yeah, but now it's like it's much more ominous, it's kind
Yeah.
of like, um and I think of Obi-Wan, and I know a lot of people feel like, oh, the Clone Wars, it was best when, we didn't know anything about them, but I like, for me, when Obi-Wan is kind of reminiscing about the past, I kind of like having that added layer of, like, as an audience kind of knowing, what happened, and kind of thinking back to the character played by Ewan McGregor, who's so, he's great, and he's, he kind of channels Alec Guinness so well, and kind of thinking about his adventures. And I'm a big, so I'll tell you what kind of was my kind of prequel. What the prequels were for the original trilogy fans. Surprisingly, that's what the CGI Clone Wars series was for me when it first came
Interesting.
out. I
Interesting.
when I saw that and I saw they gave Anakin a Padawan, I was like, what it like I'm like, This isn't, because here's the thing, I was a big fan of the Gendy Tartakovsky
Yeah, dude,
2D.
those were great. Those were great.
Yeah, so that was actually, I actually had watched those before I saw Revenge of the Sith. So to me,
Yeah, me
I was
too.
as much as I enjoyed Revenge of the Sith and it's my favorite prequel, I was a little let down with General Grievous because I'm like, hold on, like this guy is kind of like, he's in the micro series, he's this kind of like Alien meets Predator. He's this kind of like badass Jedi
Yeah,
hunting
he's terrifying.
machine, force of nature. Yeah. And in the movie, he's kind of like the mustache twirly villain who ties the lady up on the railroad tracks.
With like
He's,
a hacking cough.
yeah, who's like, and I get what George was going. George decided to take the character in a different direction. And, it's not like it is now with Disney where like everything's so carefully managed so that
Yeah.
everything lines up. George, he had his movies and he would let, he saw the value in expanding the universe, obviously. He saw the value in fan investment, but for his story that he was telling, he didn't care. He didn't
Yeah.
care what any derivative stuff was doing, So he gave them the concept art of Grievous and was just kind of like, go nuts. And then he ended up doing something different with the character. So but as a kid, that kind of bothered me because I'm like, this is not the same. I was looking forward to seeing this guy in a movie in live action, and it was not what I was expecting. But anyway, yeah, back to the CGI Clone Wars. When that first started, yeah, I was like, this looks really childish. It looks really goofy. Why is Anakin have a Padawan? That doesn't make sense. They wouldn't trust him with a Padawan. And I just wrote it off completely and I never watched it for a long time. I'm like, this clearly isn't for me. To me, the Clone Wars micro series is like it's too close to my heart. I can't accept that this seems to be retconning that completely. So I just didn't watch it for a long time, and it wasn't until, I think when the series was all on Netflix, this was before everything moved over to Disney Plus.
Yeah.
I was hearing a lot of good things about it. This was before season 7 came out. It was when, it had been canceled by
It had been
Disney.
canceled. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was hearing good things about it, and I'm like, all right, maybe I need to give this another chance and like watch it with fresh eyes. And I really love that series. I think it's really like the prequels. It is very rocky sometimes. There are certain episodes that are like, what are we even doing? But then there are other episodes that to me, and again, I'm talking to someone too who like animation. Like to me, a movie's a movie, right? And it's no less Star Wars because it's animation to me. So there's some moments in that series that are like up there with any like they're some of the highlights of Star Wars for me. So,
I've
it's
heard
a
a lot of I've heard a lot of people say that, and I'm gonna make an embarrassing confession that it will probably turn off a lot of people from ever listening to this podcast again. Aside from a handful of episodes, I've not seen the Clone Wars series.
that's okay. I mean, it I tried
Um,
to get I tried to get my friend into it, who's also I mean, she's not maybe as big a Star Wars fan now because The Rise of Skywalker, we had very similar kind of thoughts on The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker was kind of a big turnoff for both of us, but it kind of broke her more than me. And I've tried to get her to watch the Clone Wars as a way of like, hey, maybe this will get you back into Star Wars. But this was before Mandalorian and some of the new series coming out. And she just could not get through the first couple seasons. It's rough. It's rough. The Clone Wars movie that they, again, silly, crazy George Lucas idea. He just released a couple episodes of a TV series cut together and
theatrically, right?
put it in a movie theater. Yeah, it's rough. It's worse than any of the prequel films. I mean,
Would
it's
you suggest so hypothetically speaking, if I were to try to watch the show, would you suggest that I watch it in order and just try to stick it
um
out for those first Rocky seasons, or is there like a prefer? Oh, because I know that like the episodes are sort of all over the timeline, right? It's not like
yeah. So
yeah,
here's my thing. I recommend I believe I just watched it in the air date order, but I would actually recommend the chronological order,
yeah,
which you can find online. And I
sure.
think that's because some of it was production stuff, was reasons why certain episodes were aired later. So I
Oh,
don't
is that
think the
true?
yeah, I'm not sure. I know they did go back to earlier arcs and add more stuff, but I think it was always with the intent. I believe I'm not. Dave Filoni has said Clone Wars. You can just kind of pick and choose which ones you want to watch, and I think that's and I think that's true to a certain extent. But I do think there is kind of like an evolution to the characters that you miss if you don't watch. If you don't watch certain parts, because maybe they're rougher than other parts. I recommend the chronological order. I think, it's definitely intent. There's nothing about it that's not intended. Like it's not like the prequels where it's a very different experience. It's just kind of like it's just less jarring to watch it in the chronological order, in my opinion. So now in terms of like an abridged viewing guide, or something like that. I made one a while back in terms of like what episodes I think you can safely skip, etc. But honestly, I would, in the spirit of George Lucas, I would recommend just watching through it, just not liking the stuff you don't like and liking the stuff you like. I
I
think,
agree with that. That's my style too. Like if I'm gonna watch a show
yeah,
or a movie series, I just want to watch
yeah,
it all the way that it came out. Yeah.
yeah. And that's why, even though I've made my own fan edits and I really like other fan edits like Hal's, when I'm gonna show somebody Star Wars for the first time, I'm showing them the original version. I'm showing them the films as the filmmaker intended it because in terms of as the filmmaker, at least as the filmmaker intended it at some point, because I don't know if I'm going to show them the special editions.
Yeah.
But I'm going to show them. I don't want. I feel like even if a fan edit is more effective, and if like hypothetically, if that was the movie released in theaters, maybe we would have all liked it a little more. I think you have to, a film is still, regardless of how commercial it is or whatever, it's a piece of art created by a filmmaker, and you should view the piece of art as they created it first before you want. And fan edits are more like what I would do on a rewatch or like as an alternative version. But
I
it's
like that.
not. Yeah.
Yeah,
Plus,
I
I
like
think
that.
it puts you on the same when it comes to the conversation and the discourse around the movies. it puts you off on the wrong foot because you've watched a different version than like 99% of people have watched. So it kind of
Right.
so like certain details will be different. So like if someone's talking about how Padme, died at the end of Revenge of the Sith, and you're like, wait a minute, I watched the HAL 9000 version and
Right. Right.
she like I think it's important to have a baseline for what the films were before I love fan edits, and I think it's a really cool community. And I am kind of, I don't want to say necessarily death of the author, but like, I do feel like once a piece of media is put out into the universe, the
You lose
audience,
control over it to a
yeah,
degree.
the
Yeah.
audience can kind of do whatever they want with it. But the thing is, the original version is still the version, and that's the version that I would show to somebody if I was showing them the first time. So,
I agree.
um,
I respect that a
that,
lot. I think you're right on the money.
yeah, and that's how I feel about Clone Wars. I mean, so there is, I will say, um, going back to originaltrilogy.com, there is a fan edit. Someone's doing a really ambitious fan edit series of the entire series, which like is kind of like blows my mind that somebody would fan edit, 6 seasons of a television show.
You mean they're making like one long film out
No,
of the
no, no,
series?
no, 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 no,
No.
no. They are reconceptual. Some episodes are combined, others are not. Like
Oh.
they're reconceptualizing it as I think a shorter number of seasons and with like hour-long episodes. Like they're recutting it into a total. They're basically they've been so the creator is somebody who goes by the name of Eddie Dean on Fanedit, or sorry, on originaltrilogy.com, and it's called, I think, Clone Wars Refocused. And basically he's trying to conceptualize it in a style, in a kind of a content style much closer to something like The Mandalorian, where like
Oh, I see. Interesting.
the
Mhm.
episodes are like as long as they need to be.
Yeah.
Whereas Clone Wars was very much a 30-minute or 22 minute, whatever, with commercials for Cartoon Network. He's kind of reconceptualized it as a different kind of thing. He's changed like the opening and the outro credits to like really just change the tone, and like he makes lots of cuts, he combines episodes. And the idea is really because there's so much fluff and there's so much what people call, I'm not a super fan of the term all the time, but like filler. There's a lot of filler episodes. So like,
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that term.
yeah, so the idea is really like if somebody won't sit down with you and watch the whole series, you could show them this as kind
This.
of like, this is what you need to kind of like, because obviously with the stuff Dave Filoni is doing now with The Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, and now especially this Ahsoka series that's coming out, Clone Wars and Rebels are like foundational to some of like as the
Yeah,
whole
yeah, that
character of us. Yeah,
for for sure. That's why I am seriously contemplating trying to
yeah,
find the time in my life to watch those
yeah,
series because I am interested in seeing
yeah.
Ahsoka
And
when it
I was
comes
saying
out.
it's so fun. My initial reaction to the Clone Wars series is so funny because like the biggest sticking point for me was Ahsoka. And it wasn't from like, I know certain people, obviously there's gross elements of the Star Wars fandom who are like, oh, a girl in Star Wars. Like it was
No,
never
yeah,
that. It was never that, but it was kind of
I know.
like
Yeah, you
this,
don't strike me as that kind of guy.
yeah,
But I
kind of
appreciate
like
the disclaimer.
yeah, wrapping my head around the idea that Anakin had a Padawan between episodes 2 and 3 that we never heard about in the movies. Like it was almost like a bridge too far for me at the time. And
Sure.
but after I watched the series, to me the character of Ahsoka is essential to Star Wars and essential to even the arc of the prequel trilogy. Like
Wow.
even though she's not in the films, so much of her relationship with Anakin, like, informs that character in a way that it was almost in a way a little, I don't want to say do-over, but like it adds a lot more shading to the character. Like if something like the relationship with Padme or even the relationship with Obi-Wan, which mostly works for me, although there are issues with it in the prequel trilogy, Ahsoka is kind of like another anchor for that character to kind of to really land that theme of him being having a hard time letting go of things, and that's like kind of a constant with his character the prequel trilogy is that he gets attached to people,
Yeah,
and
that's the reason for his downfall,
yeah,
ultimately. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying that's a good, and I kind of subscribe to the belief with my philosophy of Star Wars, and I think it's the one that resonates with me is that attachment, that the Jedi were wrong to totally cut off attachments, that there has to be a balance. Like I'm a
Yeah.
big fan of the idea of balance, and that there needs to be balance in anything. And the spiritual aspects of the Jedi, and the kind of philosophical aspects have always interested me. And the way I kind of see it is, again, this may why I vibe so much with The Last Jedi is that it's about balance, and it's about not this kind of rigid dogmatic view, not to use the same words that Palpatine uses in Revenge of the Sith, but it's kind
No,
of
no, but that's the thing though. But
yeah,
that's the thing that I
yeah,
appreciated about that is that he's
because he's
not
not wrong. Yeah,
wrong.
he's
Yes,
not wrong. Yeah,
exactly.
and the Sith, the where he is wrong is that you know the Sith are no better. Yeah, the Sith are worse, but like the
Yeah,
Jedi are.
like context matters, like intent
Yeah,
matters. Like, it's interesting what you just said because my
yeah,
sort of read of where the Jedi Order went wrong and where we find them during the time of the prequel movies is that they're heavily influenced obviously by Buddhist philosophy of the real world and all
yeah,
sorts of uh,
mhm,
so I feel like the Jedi realized that attachment, an unhealthy attachment, is
yeah,
one of the things that will lead one to go to the dark side. And as with any large institution, what
mhm,
their solution was, okay, well, we'll just make no one allowed to have any attachments, and we don't have to worry about that ever happening, right? But then what they did was they created these sort of emotionally uh, these ill-equipped kind of inhuman weirdos that when a problem was staring them right in the face, like one of my favorite scenes in Revenge of the Sith is when Anakin goes to Yoda and he's basically asking for help. He's like, "Help me! Like I'm having all these like dreams," and all Yoda can say is, "You have to train yourself to not be afraid of losing what you love."
yeah,
And that is not helpful. Yoda is not
yeah,
meeting Anakin where he is. He doesn't have the tools to help Anakin. And it's so interesting because in that scene is Anakin, he's asking for help. He's like, I have a problem. Help
mhm,
me. Something bad is happening. I need help. And the Jedi are
yeah,
totally ill equipped to do anything about it.
exactly. And I think, to me, and that's a feature, not a bug. It's yes, Yoda. You might say, why is Yoda so cold? He's such a warm character in the original trilogy. I think, to me, it totally makes sense. It shows the progression of that character, and that he kind of lost sight, maybe, of what it was all really about. And I think, yeah, and that's why I love The Last Jedi too, is because it picks up on that theme, and it kind of like posits, maybe there's a third path kind of thing where,
And it also reiterates that he learned something that he was trying to impart to Luke and Empire. And then
yeah,
that scene with the two of them in front of the burning fire is when it really crystallizes
hmm
like the journey that Yoda went
yeah,
on. Yeah,
that scene is one of my favorite scenes in all of Star Wars, and
same.
it's because that's what it's all about. Especially watching the Kenobi series recently too. It's like, Yoda failed, Kenobi failed, and then Luke fails, but it's okay. They pick up the pieces, they kind of learn from their mistakes, and they impart onto the next generation, and hopefully they'll be able to pick up the mantle and make things a little better. And that's why, to me, if there is a theme, an overarching theme to the sequel trilogy, it's kind of the idea of the cyclical nature of, because it may be a happy accident. Like Force Awakens just kind of reestablished a lot of the same um entities that kind of exist, new versions of the same entities that existed in the original trilogy, with the First Order and the Resistance. But I think Last Jedi kind of turns that into like, you know, it's kind of like it's commenting on kind of the way things kind of happen in cycles. Luke failed the same way that Yoda and Obi-Wan kind of failed him to a certain extent. And um So to me that kind of resonates, and to me, Last Jedi is kind of about breaking that cycle, and it's kind of about how every generation, is going to be a little better than the last, and kind of learn from the mistakes of the last generation. I don't know, that was always really resonated with me, and that's why to me the prequels too are, even if there's a lot about them that doesn't work, especially Phantom Menace and clones, they're essential Star Wars to me, because to me, a lot of those, they strengthen a lot of those themes come from reading it as one big story,
Totally.
whereas
Yeah.
it, yeah. And, I think I definitely recommend Clone Wars, because I think in its best moments, it kind of captures a lot of the same themes, and it adds a lot of, you know, it adds a lot of I don't know if dimensionality is the right word, maybe more like emotionality to Anakin, to just as a character, that I just feel for him so much more than when watching the saga films, where he really, I think it's fair to say that the Anakin character didn't quite land maybe the way Lucas wanted him to, for a lot of people in the
Mm.
prequel trilogy, that they didn't find him sympathetic, or they didn't find him um, you know, relatable. And I think Lucas wants you to feel really awful when he turns to the dark side. You want to feel for him. And I think you do to a certain extent, but I think some of the stuff in clones, it doesn't, you know, there's this tendency of in clones, I feel like, and this is why it's one of my lesser Star Wars films, is this idea that he was kind of a bad seed, like that he's kind of
Yeah.
already exhibiting these kind of like this tendency, like, to me, a big mistake in the prequel trilogy is when he confesses slaughtering the Tuscans to Padme, and she
Yeah.
just kind of,
Yeah.
and
She just kind of
you could
shrugs it off. Yeah.
yeah, you could say it's making a commentary about toxic relationship, and that's the charitable way to read it, is like how in a toxic relationship, people will accept the abuse of the partner, because they're kind of looking at them through rose tinted glasses. That's like one way I could kind of like defend that, but
And even then, it's
really,
kind of like it's a
yeah,
bit of a stretch. Again, I think Lucas was referencing something he loved, which is the Searchers,
mm.
and I think he didn't necessarily view the Tuscans as fully realized humans, which
Oh,
I
that's for
actually thought
sure.
was one of my favorite things about
Book of
the Boba
Boba.
Fett series. I
Yeah,
mean, say what you will about that, but the way that they
yeah,
really developed the Tuscans, and now
yeah,
I actually make a point never to refer to them as sand people, because I
yeah.
feel like that's sort of like a,
Hmm.
I mean, I know that, like, we're talking about like a fantasy universe and nothing's real anyway,
Yeah,
but like I feel like it's a bit of a dismissive racist thing to call them sand
yeah.
people, you know?
Yeah, and I think in a way it was kind of evolving, if we're looking through the lens of Western, like it was evolving that depiction from like a 50s or something depiction to
Yes.
like a 90s Dances with
Yes.
Wolves, but I
Right.
think there's also another layer on it, because Tamara Morrison is an indigenous actor.
Yes.
So
Exactly.
I
Right.
think it's a little bit of an inversion of Dances with Wolves, because instead of the white man, kind of becoming the best native, it's an indigenous actor playing that character.
E
So it's more,
exactly.
yeah,
Just
in a
sort of
way,
helping his fellow
exactly,
indigenous,
yeah.
rise
So
up. Yeah.
I give them a lot of credit for that. My only wish is that instead of then wiping out the whole Tuscan camp just as motivation for him, I wish that
Yeah.
they had played into
More of a role, like,
yeah,
especially
his
in the
co
finale.
yeah, when he kind of builds that coalition, he's kind of building his coalition, and I wish the Tuscans kind of became a part of that,
Me too, me too, and that's where I thought it was going. Yeah.
Yeah, Book of Boba Fett is interesting, because I think, like the prequels, it can be pretty uneven, but I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I think one thing that really stood out to me as a prequel fan, that I'm like, oh, that's so George Lucas, was the what everyone made a hullabaloo about, these
Yo,
colorful
yeah, the biker gang.
Vespas.
Yeah, the Vespa
Yeah.
gang. Yeah, that was very Lucas. That was like the diner in Attack of the Clone. Like, and the
Lucas
yellow hot rod speeder, like, that's what
Mhm.
that was.
Yeah, because Lucas loves, I mean, he made American Graffiti. He loves
Yes.
classic cars. He loves this like 50s aesthetic. the 1950s kind of kitsch aesthetic, and
And
I thought that
that's
that
100% what
yeah,
that was. Yeah.
and there were so many fans who are like, and I understand if it kind of, maybe it doesn't fit with the Tatooine atmosphere, but there were so many fans that were like, this isn't Star Wars, and I'm like, this is so Star Wars. This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
George Lucas. Like,
This is very Star Wars. And the
yeah,
other thing about, like, this in Tatooine, like, I think science fiction and Star Wars in particular tends to forget planets are big.
yeah,
Like,
hmm
every
yeah,
single style of clothing, every single accent that we know has all
yeah,
come from one planet. So
yeah,
so the idea that there's
yeah.
like a different flavor or a different
hmm
side of this planet that we haven't seen, it sort of scans for me.
Yeah. I was talking about the Clone Wars micro series before, and I think one of the things that really helped me in terms of the aesthetics of the prequels not have an issue with it as other fans maybe do is that to me the prequels are almost like it's almost like a different medium than the original trilogy. It's like it's storytelling in a different mode. And to me, the fact that Star Wars for me, it's sometimes animated, it's sometimes textual, a book, to me, the fact that Star Wars could span so many different mediums, it kind of made it so that it didn't matter that it looked different, because it was just kind of a different, yeah, it was a different medium in a way. It was the digital filmmaking and the CGI wasn't naturalistic. It wasn't true to life, but it was telling that story. That was just a different medium to tell the story. And so that's one thing I wanted to say. The other
I love that. I
thing,
agree with you
yeah,
100%. Like, my only quibble that I'm not saying that I'm right, but I love what you just said. But for me, the fact that that was supposed to be part of one cohesive story,
hmm
the separate, like,
yeah,
changing mediums, in
I can
quotations halfway through, for me was a little
I can see
challenging.
that. Yeah, and I think it does help that there's a big time gap between the prequels and I mean, it's not that big, it's 20 years, but, which is maybe less than some people thought originally, but it does help me a little bit, kind of these are kind of subunits. The prequel trilogy and the original trilogy are kind of subunits of this larger story, and they have their kind of own aesthetic sensibilities.
Did you know that John Williams actually wanted to record a new main theme for the opening crawl for the
Oh,
prequels?
wow. I think I might have heard that. Yeah, that's interesting.
And George Lucas said, "No, it's gotta be the same theme, because I want it to be one cohesive thing." But in retrospect, hearing what you just said about, like, how,
Yeah.
like, that's sort of a subunit, I actually kind of would have liked that, because I
Yeah.
think that
Well,
that would have helped viewing the films as those sort of subunits the way
yeah.
that you just described.
And I think that's kind of that ended up he maybe learned from his lessons a bit because with the Clone Wars series, I remember one direction from George Lucas was to Kevin Kiner, the composer from that for that series, is I don't want it to sound like John Williams. I want it to be its own thing. And
Interesting.
I think that was in that case, that was kind of a smart decision. And I think he does use the Williams themes like very sparingly in certain moments, much like the newer shows do, like Mandalorian and Obi-Wan, and but the music there was much less There was orchestral aspects to it, but it was much more like poppy a little bit. There was, it wasn't quite the same. It wasn't the John Williams style, much of the way that Mandalorian is kind of, influenced by spaghetti westerns and it's
Hmm.
own style of music. Clone Wars has kind of its own style of music, and I think that was smart. I will say I wouldn't trade the scores for the prequel trilogy for anything, but so
They're fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah. No, they're
me
amazing.
and I used to listen to a podcast called Star Wars Oxygen, and then
I was just telling someone about
yeah,
that yesterday, and
that be yeah,
I love those podcasts.
and that became the soundtrack show when he started his own show. He works at Lucasfilm. I'm forgetting the name of the
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name. I'll look it up
yeah.
because I just sent someone the link.
So I did kind of want to talk a little bit about what actually rehabilitated my enjoyment of the prequels because
Yeah, please.
yeah, like I said, I went through a phase like where it was like the prequels were the cool thing to hate or whatever. And there were a few different things that I think rehabilitated my enjoyment. One was, funny enough, the prequel memes community and subreddit, which I think has turned, unfortunately, a little bit toxic, like all Star Wars fandom things have. It's kind of like the prequel memes because the prequels are better than the sequels. Blah blah. What,
Yeah.
everything's a competition. But to me, there's a camp value in the prequels, and I don't mean that in like a
Derogatory way.
in like derogatory way. I love Revenge of the Sith, and even some of the lines that are very corny, I love them. Like the whole like exchange that like General Kenobi, like hello
Yeah.
there, like that. I love all that stuff because it has a camp value. It's a bit larger than life to me. Revenge of the Sith is a very maximalist film, and it's very it's very formalist. It's not concerned with depicting things as opposed to maybe something like Empire Strikes Back, which really is about the characters and it's about
More naturalistic
kind
and
of
more.
naturalistic performances, kind of
Yeah.
the way real people interact with each other. I think that's one thing that's helped me a lot with the prequels is it doesn't have to be the way real people interact because it's a fairy tale. It's a representation. It represents a mode of storytelling, much like in a musical. It doesn't matter that the characters break out in song, even though like in real life people wouldn't do that. I kind of feel like the same way to a certain extent, to a lesser extent about Revenge of the Sith and the prequels is the performances are larger than life. If you look at the best performance, in my opinion, the best performance in the prequel trilogy is Ian McDermott.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
because
it's
he knows exactly how to play it, and
yeah,
he hits it perfectly.
yeah, and it's camp, it's camp. It's not a lot of times it's not subtle, it's not understated, it's overstated, but that's a valid stylistic way of doing it. And I think that's really the only way to do George Lucas's dialogue sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think with the performers that kind of knew that's what it was and they were leading into it, I think of McDermott, I think of Ewan McGregor. um, I think it really works, and to me, I kind of so like to me, so many prequel lines, despite them having quote unquote bad dialogue, and I wouldn't disagree that the dialogue is not you know if you not what you'd want to show off in a film class as an example of great dialogue, but
Yeah, like, it's
the
not
lines,
Mammoth.
yeah, the lines have become iconic. A lot of the prequel lines have become iconic because of the camp quality, because of how larger than life and specific they are. They're so specific to George's sensibilities that, it's kind of endearing to me. And I think that was something that helped me warm up to the prequels. Other aspects were, like I said, the Clone Wars series. When I finally got into that and kind of got past my preconceived notions of that kind of really enriched my kind of reading of those films and get more invested in characters. And the other thing was the fan edit community. You know, um, like watching fan edits, it can trim out the sticking points, the kind of things that you can't get past when you're just trying to absorb the film. There's certain things that take you out of it. And fan edits for a long time were kind of a way for me to watch the films and have it be a smooth experience, not have to, just kind of like breeze past those moments in a fan edit and just focus on the stuff that works.
Yeah, they sort of allow you to see the film that is there.
Yeah, exactly. You're not so hung up on the aspects that don't work because, it lets you see the aspects that do work. And
Yeah.
and again, like as I started to appreciate the films more, my taste in fan edits has even changed where I prefer a little more conservative, a little like has a little more of the flavor of the original thing. But yeah, so really those three things, the fan edits, and to a lesser extent also the for a little while I was never a star so I grew up with the Knights of the Old Republic video game. And
Hmm.
that's probably another reason why I was very like a Jedi focused fan and not
That
a
makes sense.
smugglers, in that side of the universe. Knights of the Old Republic is all about the Old Republic and the Jedi, and so that was kind of a big thing for me. But I was never really into the expanded universe, meaning like the books and stuff, and that was until I would say around like 2014, like basically in the lead up to Force Awakens, I kind of
Mm.
got back into Star Wars, watching the Clone Wars, and kind of because I got excited about Star Wars again, and I kind of wanted to absorb everything I could. And I read a couple expanded universe novels, some which were early Disney canon, others which were non-canon at that point. But what does that mean anyway? But the Darth Plagueis novel, um,
I've heard good things about that.
yeah, it really like specifically the Phantom Menace. I feel like it really I don't want to say it rehabilitates that movie, but a lot of the things that might have you scratching your head when you watch the movie, it kind of gives justification for. And that's kind of my one criticism of the novel, actually, as well, is that it feels more like a patch to the movie than it does like a engrossing story in its own right.
Mm.
Um, but there's so much more like, and this is something the Plinkett reviews harped on a lot. It's kind of the inscrutable politics of the Phantom Menace, and I don't when I watch the film now, I don't think they're inscrutable at all. I think the message George is sending is perfectly clear, and I think the political scenes are integral to the film. I don't think, when people say like, oh, the problem with the prequels was all the politics, it was boring. That's one of my favorite part of the prequels. So I'm
I
not
agree with you.
um even something like, for example, you look at how A New Hope, and I think one, it had to be that way because I think the original trilogy was very much a traditional hero's journey story. And it was a triumphant story, a triumphant ending. It ended on an up. The prequels were always going to end on a downer, and there were always
Mm.
going to have to be, well, how did we get here? It was kind of a story about what has to happen to our systems as a society. How do we decay to the point where something like this can happen, where like a person can do these things? And one of the things I love about Revenge of the Sith is that it is kind of looking on that on an interpersonal level between like Anakin and Kenobi, and on a societal level and a systems level of kind of, and that's where I do feel like some of those deleted scenes add a lot to it as well. Specifically, I'm thinking of the stuff with Padme and Bail Organa,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
but it's kind of like the collapse of society, and it's kind of like in this fulcrum point is this one man. And I don't know, I just think it's really ambitious, and it's really, there's actually an art critic named Camille Paglia, and she's like a fine art critic. She has a book where she wrote a great piece on Revenge of the Sith and why she thinks it's like one of the greatest like 21st century works of art or something. And it's
I
like,
must read this. I've never.
honestly, I haven't read the full book. I have to confess, I just read the section on Star Wars, but it's called Glittering Images by Camille Paglia. And she writes about Star Wars and then about Revenge of the Sith specifically, and specifically the climax of the movie and kind of the intercut duels into kind of like the ending and the kind of ending montage of like Padme giving birth, well, contrasted with essentially the death of Anakin and him
And the
kind of
birth of
a
Vader and the death.
rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah, a rebirth of Vader, his rebirth as Vader. It's kind of the death of Padme and the death of Anakin and the birth of Vader and the birth of the twins, and this kind of this parallelism. And then kind of she talks about kind of like how she sees like having Bail and Obi-Wan, how they are kind of presented as like nurturing male figure in kind of the end where he's handing off the baby. Like, it's a little like high-minded, but it's really compelling. And I definitely recommend that as a read. And the other thing I was going to say is with the opening of Phantom Menace, a lot of people say, why is it so slow? Why is it so boring? Compared to like something like A New Hope, where it's a bombastic opening. It's like we're in the middle of a firefight. And I think the way I see it is what George was trying to say with that is kind of how the banality of evil and how evil kind of slowly seeps into, it's in these kind of boring trade disputes, people get complacent and they don't see the kind of the again, the phantom menace. Like it couldn't be more on the nose, kind of lurking underneath. I feel like it's super kind of prescient in terms of like the direction our society has
Yeah.
gone. I mean, I don't want to get too political on your show, but it's this kind of like there's a bunch of people kind of being like, nothing's wrong. This is, whereas, there's something clearly wrong. Something is clearly afoot. It's this kind of veneer. And the whole idea with the fandom is this kind of veneer of everything being perfect and beautiful, where
While
there's
it's
this kind
rotting
of,
from the inside
it's
out.
rotting from the inside out. And I thought that was really beautiful and really conceptually interesting. So, like, I don't really have that issue of the opening. It's not an accident that the movie starts slow. It's intentionally a contrast to A New Hope. And I think even the fact that in A New Hope, it's Leia saying, well, I'm a senator. I'm a dignitary, and in this situation, it's the villains. It's the Nemoidians being like, well, what we're doing is legal, we're upstanding. It's kind of an inversion of that. And I think,
Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan is where
yeah,
that name comes from. Not they're these movies are very political. George is saying something very specific and it's not subtle. The one thing that I will say in regards to the politics of it all is I used to think that the prequel depiction of, the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire, and even the fall of Anakin to a degree, were, kind of facile and simplistic, and I didn't really buy it.
yeah, hmm
But as the years have gone on, and I have seen what has been happening in the real world,
yeah,
I think the prequels are more prescient, as you said, and I appreciate them and understand them a lot more than I did when they originally came out.
yeah. It reminds me of the kind of the criticism of like obviously on a whole different kind of movie, whole different tier than the prequels, but a movie like Jaws where people would be like, well, why didn't that's not realistic. They would absolutely close the beach right away.
Like,
you know,
no, they would. It's like,
and
no,
like, yeah,
they wouldn't.
yeah.
No,
You
they
look
wouldn't.
at the world we live in now, it's
Yeah,
like,
it's like,
yeah.
it, yeah, yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. Um, I want to thank you, Keith. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really appreciate you being game to come on and have this chat. And I'm gonna watch the Clone Wars based on what you said. I think you sold me.
Cool. You'll have to let me know how it goes.
I will. I will. Again, I want to thank Keith for his time and his patience while I sat on this episode for almost a year, but it's finally out there and hitting your ears. So thank you, Keith. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe, like, rate, and review the show on your platform of choice. We are TrashCompod across all social media, and you can email us at trashcompod@gmail.com. Transcripts of this episode and all our other episodes are available at trashcompod.com. And as always, we will see you on the next one.